Easter 1916, for Ireland in Revolution. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces, from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it, where long-legged moorhens dive and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, Macdonough and Macbride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. It's unquestionably one of Yeats's greatest poems, and it comes at an extraordinary moment in Irish history, the Easter 1916 Rising. In our last lecture, we looked a little bit at Yeats's essay from 1910, J.M. Synge and the Ireland of His Time. And in order to make sense of this poem, I want to return there and pick up the thread of the problem of what degeneration theory and what Yeats called in that essay the morbid persistence of minds unsettled by some fixed idea. Yeats claims that nationalism makes people bitter, abstract, and preoccupied in a way that morally deforms them, but also makes it impossible to produce important art. He goes on in the essay, where we'll pick it up, to say, they are preoccupied with the nation's future, with heroes, poets, soldiers, painters, armies, fleets, but only as these things are understood by a child in a national school, while a secret feeling that what is so unreal needs continual defense makes them bitter and restless. Even if what one defends be true, an attitude of defense, a continual apology, whatever the cause, makes the mind barren because it kills intellectual innocence. That delight in what is unforeseen, and in the mere spectacle of the world, the mere drifting hither and thither that must come before all true thought and emotion. A zealous Irishman, especially if he lives much out of Ireland, spends his time in a never-ending argument about Oliver Cromwell, the Danes, the penal laws, the rebellion of 1798, the famine, the Irish peasant, and ends by substituting a traditional casuistry for a country. And if he be a Catholic, yet another casuistry that has professors, schoolmasters, letter-writing priests and the authors of manuals to make the meshes fine, comes between him and English literature, substituting arguments and hesitations for the excitement at the first reading of the great poets, which should be a sort of violent imaginative puberty. How can one, if one's mind be full of abstractions and images, create not for their own sake, but for the sake of party, even if there were still the need, make pictures for the mind's eye and sounds that delight the ear, or discover thoughts that tighten the muscles, or quiver and tingle in the flesh, and so stand like Saint Michael with the trumpet that calls the body to resurrection? Here also Yeats is turning on the ballad tradition as an inadequate vehicle for proper Irish national sentiment. It can produce nationalist sentiment, but not national sentiment, by which he means a sentiment that is capable of apprehending the complexity of being as a kind of ongoing process, the drifting hither and thither. And this image of ongoing flux, the idea of existence as a kind of endlessly complex process of the unfolding of elementary particles, is actually central to the 1916 poem In the Image of the River. It was Heraclitus, I think, who said, "A man never steps in the same river twice," for the simple reason that, though the name of the river and the river remains a constant, all of the particles that constitute the river have changed in the meantime. So it's a great image and a defining image in Greek philosophy of fixity and flux and the complex relationship between the two. And that issue of fixity and flux is here in the critique of Irish nationalist ballads, rendered in its artistic mode, by which I mean the Irish nationalist is getting so fixated on nationalism that he's missing the flux of the form of true being, and it becomes an abstract tradition divorced from reality, the reality of flux. And this had another iteration for us in the concept of degeneration, that odd notion where he talks about the crying down of the natural impulses of the mind with the morbid persistence of minds unsettled by some fixed idea. And the idea of being unsettled by fixation is itself a great convergence of the two themes of fixity and flux. But it's precisely what happens to people who have fixations. They are deeply unsettled by them. And that's Yeats's point. You can see how Yeats is having an argument with his earlier self as well as the Irish people, and disowning a huge amount of his own prior agenda in pointing out now how, in fact, art ought to take priority over nationalist art, and that art for the nation must not itself become merely nationalist or fixated. I want to go out now to have a little look at this concept of degeneration in order to thicken this debate, because what you'll see about what Yeats is saying about the impact of politics on the Irish people, making them bitter and restless and making the mind barren, killing intellectual innocence. This is an argument that Yeats has in particular with Irish women, women like Maud Gonne and Constance Markievicz, who played active roles in the Irish Republican movement. Markievicz going so far as to join as one of the leaders of the 1916 rebellion and to be sentenced to death for it, though later given an amnesty and surviving. So that what Yeats says is that, and it's an argument that he continues to have in his later poetry, we'll be seeing it in A Prayer for My Daughter, that a preoccupation with politics deforms women morally, and it makes them less attractive, less interesting. And we'll see that too in the 1916 Rising poem. But first, let's go to degeneration theory. I've given you just a page here from the book Degeneration Theory by Max Nordau, one of the early chapters on what he calls mysticism. Mysticism being the kind of generalized brain fog of the degenerate. So I'm just going to read a passage here, and you'll see how Max Nordau, who is a doctor and a kind of pointed critic of literature, not a maybe particularly good one, but that didn't stop him from writing 600 pages of literary criticism. He starts out with a kind of medical diagnosis of what degenerate thought is at the level of form. And then he goes on to talk about symbolist poetry as a degenerate form, mentioning our friend Paul Verlaine, who was the subject of Yeats's early essay, Hopes and Fears in Irish Literature. So we'll read it first, then we'll remind ourselves of Yeats, and then we'll talk a little bit about degeneration, fixation, and fugitive ideas. This is what Mallarmé means when he says, to name an object means to suppress 3/4 of the pleasure. Our dream should be to suggest the object. Moreover, the thought of a healthy brain has a flow, which is regulated by the laws of logic and the supervision of attention. It takes for its content a definite object, manipulates and exhausts it. The healthy man can tell what he thinks, and his telling has a beginning and an end. The mystic imbecile thinks merely according to the laws of association, and without the red thread of attention. He has fugitive ideation. He can never state accurately what he is thinking about. He can only denote the emotion which at the moment controls his consciousness. He can only say in general, I am sad, I am merry, I am fond, I am afraid. His mind is filled with evanescent, floating, cloudy ideas which make their hue from the reigning emotion, as the vapor hovering above a crater flames red from the glow at the bottom of the volcanic cauldron. When he poetizes, therefore, he will never develop a logical train of thought, but will seek by means of obscure words of distinctly emotional coloring to represent a feeling, a mood. What he prizes in poetical works is not a clear narrative, the exposition of a definite thought, but only the reflected image of a mood which awakens in him a similar, but not necessarily the same mood. The degenerate are well aware of this difference between a work which expresses strong mental labor and one in which merely emotionally colored fugitive ideation ebbs and flows, and they eagerly ask for a distinguishing name for that kind of poetry of which alone they have any understanding. In France, they have found this designation in the word symbolism. The explanations which the symbolists themselves give of their cognomen appear nonsensical, but the psychologist gathers clearly from their babbling and stammering that under the name symbol, they understand a word or series of words expressing not a fact of the external world or of conscious thought, but ambiguous glimmer of an idea, which does not force the reader to think, but allows him to dream, and hence brings about no intellectual processes, but only moods. The great poet of the symbolists, their most admired model, from whom, according to their unanimous testimony, they have received the strongest inspiration, is Paul Verlaine. In this man we find, in astonishing completeness, all the physical and mental marks of degeneration, and no author known to me answers so exactly, trait for trait, to the description of the degenerate given by the clinicists, his personal experience, the history of his life, his intellect, his world of ideas and modes of expression. Monsieur Jules Huret gives the following account of Verlaine's physical appearance. His face like that of a wicked angel grown old, with a thin, untrimmed beard and abrupt nose, his bushy, bristly eyebrows resembling bearded wheat, hiding deep-set green eyes, his wholly bald and huge, long skull misshapen by enigmatic bumps, all this to give his physiognomy a contradictory appearance of stubborn asceticism and cyclopean appetites. Okay, we'll stop there. I just want to remind us of what Yeats had earlier said in Hopes and Fears about Verlaine and his poetry. You remember at that time that he was contrasting Ireland with the French symbolists on the basis that Ireland was living in a young age full of hope and promise. So here's what he says about Verlaine. Never before, perhaps, were men so anxious to write their best, as they conceive that best, and so entirely loath to bow to the prejudices of the multitude. There is much to be said even for Verlaine, for he who writes well and lives badly is usually of more service to the world at large than he who writes badly and lives well. And he is always better than the crowd, who do both indifferently. But one thing cannot be said. It is not possible to call a literature produced in this way the literature of energy and youth. The age which has produced it is getting old and feeble, and sits in the chimney corner carving all manner of curious and even beautiful things upon the staff that can no longer guide its steps. Here in Ireland we are living in a young age full of hope and promise, a young age which has only just begun to make its literature. That's 1892. By 1910, Yeats is warning us that in fact, Irish art is degenerating precisely to the extent that it is becoming nationalist. In this degeneration section, there's a few things I'd like you to bear in mind as we go back to the poem 1916. If we take this first sentence, the thought of a healthy brain has a flow which is regulated by the laws of logic and the supervision of attention. This notion of flow again, like the river in the poem, like the stream of consciousness of modernist writing, and like the perceptual flow of experience being in the world, we have this sense of ongoing flow and then a perceptual mechanism that makes sense of it, regulated by the laws of logic and the supervision of attention. For Max Nordau, degenerates suffer from what would become known as attention deficit disorder, that they can only apprehend, they can't comprehend, and they can't process, and they can't categorize and make sense of experience. Fugitive ideation, he calls it, hence mysticism. And this is the kind of poetry that he associates with the French symbolists, more keen to evoke a mood than an object. In other words, not real, not concrete, not accountable to reality. But this notion of the tension between fixity and flow, the flow of perception and the ability to fix perception into objects, there's a kind of continuum here after all, because you need to be able to fix the flow long enough to be able to apply the laws of logic to it, but you don't want to become fixated on it and begin to miss the next aspect of the flow. So you see the tension here is a dialectical one between fix and flow, or what will become in the poem, river and stone. And Yeats is saying that Irish nationalist ballads and Irish people have become fixated on nationalist sentiment and hatred for England. In the earlier works like Kathleen Ni Houlihan, they were fixated on money and marriage. And he was telling them to switch out that fixation and fixate on the nation for once and make the ultimate sacrifice. Now, because they've stopped listening to him, he's suggesting that making a sacrifice for the nation can itself become part of the problem, especially as a function of the embitterment that he sees as stemming from the fixation on nationalist ideas. So Ireland was exempt from the degeneration hypothesis in Hopes and Fears, and it is now subject to the degeneration hypothesis, the literature of exhaustion, to the extent that it begins to cultivate a preoccupation with Irish national politics. So we'll just go back here. What did I do there? Not that one. Austria. This one. After a while, in a land that has given itself to agitation overmuch, abstract thoughts are raised up between men's minds and nature, who never does the same thing twice, or makes one man like another, till minds whose patriotism is perhaps great enough to carry them to the scaffold, cry down natural impulse with the morbid persistence of minds unsettled by some fixed idea. There's a fabulous logic or illogic to that sentence, but it's the logic of degeneration theory and the kind of dialectics of fix and flux that we've been identifying. If you can't fixate at all, you can't make any sense of the stream of consciousness, the big, blooming, buzzing confusion of perceptual experience, as William James called it. But if you fixate too long on one thing, you become abstracted and distracted from the flux. The paradox again is that fixation and abstraction come from an excess of what he calls agitation, a land that has given itself to agitation over much. But the agitation somehow produces fixation and abstraction from experience. So again, at one point he's telling us that, as in a play like Kathleen Ni Houlihan, that we need to make the ultimate agitation and bleed into the soil to redeem it for the nation. Soon after, he's telling us that Ireland's a little bit over preoccupied, given over entirely to politics in a way that's deforming it morally, mentally, and perhaps even physically. Yeats would become profoundly convinced of the idea that Catholic Ireland was a degenerate place, full of Catholic people having too many babies, each of which was degenerating further. And this would become part of his biopolitics of Protestant ascendancy, which we will see as the course continues. So, from there, let's go back to 1916 and see where we have gotten. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed, with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire of the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. In this first verse, Yeats is registering the estrangement that has occurred between him and the common people of Ireland. Remember that Kathleen Ni Houlihan is a play all about strangers and estrangement, how a strange old woman comes in and renders Michael a stranger to his own life and to his own prospective wife, and he goes off and dies for Ireland, largely because Yeats and Lady Gregory had told him to in a play called Kathleen Ni Houlihan. In the meantime, Yeats has grown apart from the Irish cause, largely or significant, partly due to maturity and changing ideas, partly due to changing situations and circumstances of the politics themselves, but also in significant measure because his interest in politics and republicanism was refracted through his love for Maud Gonne. And she had gotten married to one of the men, suddenly married in a way that broke Yeats's heart and devastated him, to one of the men who's mentioned in this poem. So in the first verse, the 18th century houses, the 18th century was Yeats's favorite Irish century because it was the century in which the Irish Protestant ascendancy had their own parliament in Ireland, and it was the kind of heyday of the colonial settler class. And it's against the backdrop of these houses that he's passing on the street now and merely nodding or saying nothing to the Irish that he meets. Polite, meaningless words are all that have left. Works like Kathleen Ni Houlihan were a profound conversation with the Irish people about their future, hopes and fears for Irish literature. By now, Yeats is saying he doesn't really have any hopes and fears for Irish literature. He has hopes and fears for his own literature, and the Irish literature, such as it is going to be a kind of fixation on hatred for England. And you can see him in this first verse recycling the encounters with the natives for talk in the club, the Kildare Street Club, where the gentlemen of Ireland gathered in one of those private clubs that was an expression of distinction and, of course, nominally closed to Catholics. So he would gather there with his friends afterwards and sneer at the Irish people he'd met, the Paugenes and the Biddies, as he was given to calling them by now in poems like September 1913. But 1916 knocks him on his arse, and that's what this poem's greatness resides in, the frankness with which he admits that everything he had said has changed, that the very people that he was indicting in September 1913 for being born to pray and save had turned around and done exactly what Kathleen Ni Houlihan had said they should do, and spilt their blood for the Irish cause. And this outflanked Yeats in such a decisive way that he had to write a poem admitting that this was a transformative moment in Irish history. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So that it goes from the land of the fool. You remember the fool and the blind man in Amboya Strand. Well, he's talking to the men in Kildare Street Club about Ireland as the place where motley is worn. But all of that has changed now, and blood sacrifice has redeemed the integrity of the Irish Republican movement. So the second verse, he goes on to name some of those who have been arrested. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument, until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful, she rode to harriers? This is the Countess Constance Markievicz, whom Yeats had known since the 1890s, Pethica tells us, and who was initially sentenced to death for her part in the Easter Rising, but was later given amnesty and released in 1917. And here, Yeats makes the argument that he's going to make against Markievicz and Maud Gonne, and by implication, any woman who gets involved in politics, is that they lose their good nature, their goodwill, and they are marred morally by their engagement with politics. Her days spent in ignorant goodwill until her voice grows shrill, that image is an index of her deformity. Sorry, I'm losing the thread here. What Yeats is trying to do here is to suggest that women have no business dying for Ireland, that it's an affair for men. It was Michael Gillan that the old woman was after. She had no interest in Delia Cahill. But this is, of course, a sexist argument, suggesting that women are somehow congenitally unsuited to politics and revolution. And this is an argument that gets Yeats into a lot of trouble. And it's also an argument that does a violent disservice to the many women who played central roles in Irish republicanism then and now. They have always been intimately linked to the movement and at its service. Constance Markievicz was perhaps one of the few who got involved in the Rising directly. She led one of the battalions, but there were plenty of women as the backbone of the movement. And I've given you links to some documentaries where you can follow that debate. He goes on then to talk about the other men. This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in this casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Yeats makes the point, and this is an aspect of the 1916 Rising that has come in for a lot of commentary since, that it was in a sense a dramatic play in its own right, a theatrical production, that it was a symbolic gesture. There was no sense in which this was thought of as a credible military attempt to bring down the British government in Ireland. But what the rebels were doing was making a statement and a sacrifice, and they were going to maneuver England into the position where England showed its colonial claws, used or abused its monopoly on violence as the colonial state, and in doing so, turned them into martyrs and heroes whose death would in fact invigorate the Republican and separatist movement. And it worked. In significant measure, it worked. gambled on the English executing them as part of a kind of symbolic show of domination against the Irish, which the English did. And then the Irish people, who had thought the rebels misguided, crazy, at the time of the rising, turned and swung in support of them when they saw them being executed day after day, 2 by 2, with James Connolly strapped famously to a wheelchair. And the Irish watched this in horror, and suddenly they began to feel the indignation of the rebels and identify with it again. So Yeats is talking about this casual comedy, this notion of them kind of just almost slipping off the stage. And he's using theatre metaphors because he's very much engaged in Irish theatre history himself through the Abbey Theatre, but that he knows that many of the people who died in the 1916 Rising were poets, but they were also poets with experience in the dramatic arts. And then we get to the central image of fixity and flux, the stone and the river, that we see goes back to Greek philosophy at very least, and then moves up through the degeneration theory problem of the 19th century and issues then in this obscure passage in Yeats's poem. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it, where long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Even in the rhythm of this verse, you'll see how it's about process, that you keep reading these run-on lines that flow like a river, like the flux that the verse is describing. And Yeats is making the point that life is perpetual change, minute by minute. But that these hearts with one purpose alone, the fanatic heart of the 1916 Rising, the rebels, and anyone who's willing to die for Ireland, all of a sudden, that Michael Gillane, the person who will die of blood sacrifice, is deemed by Yeats to have or to suffer from a fixation. What was earlier, and it was, I suppose, even in Yeats's Houlihan play, it was depicted at that time as a species of magical enchantment, that you had to be out of your mind to do it. Whether that's a fair representation of the rebels is another thing. They leave very eloquent testimony to the pragmatism of what they were doing. And we don't have to pathologize them in order to understand their gesture, but Yeats does. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. And so that this notion of fixation, which we saw in the J.M. Synge and the Ireland of His Time essay, this notion of the morbid fixation on a fixed idea, is brought into the poem here. And the stone is set down in the middle of a river of the flux of experience, which of course it can no longer apprehend. It is something that is circumvented by the flux as river around a stone and sits there in the middle of it all, impervious to the reality of what it purports to understand. It is both a part and apart from reality, a part of it and apart from it. And then he goes on to link this notion of the stone to the idea of sacrifice. And you'll see how the Yeats who was calling for sacrifice in Kathleen Ni Houlihan has reached a limit now, the same limit of the Synge essay. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Or when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. So Yeats brings up a question about how much sacrifice for Ireland is enough, but he doesn't dare to answer it. And he realizes in this moment that it's none of his business to decide. It's already been decided, and decided in the most devastating way by those who gave up their life in the Rising. So he kicks the idea up into the cosmos, asks the question, and then tosses it to heaven. That is heaven's part. His part now is to play a role in the commemoration of the martyrs. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. Here again, Yeats is suggesting that the action of the 1916 rebels was a symptom of a loss of control or a fanaticism, like the tumult of limbs that had run wild. He couldn't allow for it to be a politically deliberated act. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. Here Yeats is asking again a number of questions. Did they need to go out and push the agenda of separatism so far, given that the English were and had been for a long time flirting with the possibility of home rule for Ireland? That England may keep faith for all that is done and said? And then again, he doesn't answer the question. We know their dream. Enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? In other words, Yeats realizes that he's both mischievously asking the question and then claiming it would be impudent to ask such a question. And again, he restates, and just by dint of repetition, makes the case that it was an excessive act, an act of bewilderment, that you couldn't again be in your right mind, know what you were doing, and choose to do what the rebels had done. This is a poem written by a man who's been outflanked. It's an extraordinary response to that experience. And so he ends with an act of commemoration. I write it out in a verse, Macdonough and Macbride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.